only people of a certain age will understand this first remark, but this is an evening when I try to impersonate Michael Parkinson, and I hope that Anthony doesn't try to impersonate Rod Hull and Emu's attack on Michael Parkinson, which, there you go, which some of you might remember from the mid-1970s. I'd like to first ask you about political biography. Those biographies you wrote, I won't say in your spare time, but whilst you had also a full-time job as a head teacher, they're a phenomenal achievement, really. When you write a political biography of one of the country's most important figures, how much access do you get?
So, can I just say it's very lovely to see you all, and thank you for coming tonight. And I'm looking forward to it so much. I've got a huge and profound respect for the university and those who work in it and study in it. So, lots of access. But you know, so I felt sorry for John Major, and because although I knew very little about him, I did know the people who were attacking him were people who I thought were not good people. And so I wrote to him, Philip, in almost exactly 25 years ago, and said to him, you know, I'd quite like to write your book. And I really expected to get no reply at all. And it's almost like the next day I got a letter through the letterbox that came through with 10 Downing Street on the back, very lovely. And I just sort of saved it a bit before reading, you know, the Prime Minister's fascinated that you're writing his book, but regrets he's too busy. And you know, it started, the Prime Minister's fascinated, you know, to hear you want to write a book about him. When can you drop by? You know, when you have time, I think, you know, when you have time, can you drop by? So I thought, you know, do I have time for the Prime Minister? No. So that was the end of that. But no, I went in, and they've always been slightly different. So I've done Major, that was about 300,000 words, I think. And then I was going to stop, and I did first one on Blair, and then a second one on Blair. And then I was talking to the Cabinet Secretary, Jeremy Hayward, in fact, it was, you know, at a dinner, and he said, you haven't written on Gordon. And I said, come on, book on Gordon. I mean, a bit of a contradiction in terms. And but I thought, well, why not? I promised my wife that I wouldn't write another of these books, so I decided just to write on his time at Downing Street, so called it Brown at 10. And that was such fun. I then did Cameron at 10, and I'm now writing, can you guess, a book called May at 10, and a book called Life at 10, and then Life after 10. So you get a lot of access. I mean, Major probably more than I needed, but was always lovely. Blair not, Gordon Blair less, Gordon absolutely not at all. Cameron lots. And it was interesting, you know, it's interesting to be with them and see them in action. And so I spent a day do you remember, all of you, some of you will, the 97 general election campaign. And at the time I was writing at that, I was teaching at a school in Catford, and I was on the battle bus with Norma and John Major and staff, and you know, I was very conscientious that those school teachers amongst you know that if you don't get on top of your essays, they don't, you know, go away. You've got to keep on top of your marking. So I was marking essays in a quiet moment on the trip, and the title was, why did the Conservatives lose the general election so badly in 1945, which, if you don't know, was a really bad election for the Conservatives. And he looked over and he said, do you think it's going to be as bad for me against Blair as it was in 1945? And I just had a kind of devilish moment. And I looked up at him, because I was sitting down, and looked up at him in the coach aisle, and I said, no, I think it's going to be worse. Anyway, it's useful, but you know, actually you learn much more by talking to the people around, the Francis Campbells of this world, the people who watch are often much more interesting than the principals themselves, because these are not psychologically very interesting people. They're very unreflective prime ministers, most of them, and what they say about themselves is often not terribly interesting. I mean, you know, I'll look at Andrew Marr, for goodness sake.
I've marked essays on the top of a bus myself, actually, but politicians come in for a lot of stick, like journalists and bankers in many ways. Do you think they're basically good people doing the best they can for the country?
Well, I think everybody. My belief is that everybody is a good person deep down. So some people you've got to go quite deep to find the goodness. But you know, because I'm neither left nor right, I don't come at these people from a judgmental point of view, and I try and suspend judgment when I'm writing. What I'm interested in is what did they do and why did they do it. And if you're a prime minister, you have any day you could spend seeing one of 500 different people. Why do they decide to see the people they see, to go to the places that they go to say the things that they do? And that's what really fascinates me. I try and be as unjudgmental about them and to get right under their skin and to make it from inside them, rather than to be standing in judgment. And at all times I try and avoid any sneery or cynical comments. So, yeah.
And David Cameron, whilst Tony Blair was still Prime Minister, described himself as heir to Blair. And one mischievous Conservative MP actually described the Gordon Brown, George Osborne era as the Brown-born era, so similar in many respects were their budgets in terms of tinkering and micromanaging the economy and so on. Is it fair to argue that the Cameron regime was just a continuation of the New Labour
I think in many ways, Philip, it was. And I think to understand why, you have to look at how very unusual Tony Blair was in the history of the Labour Party. So you've only had 6 Labour Prime Ministers in history, and he did something unusual. The Conservative Party dominated the 20th century, and it was the Conservative century because they managed to position themselves in the centre ground, a non-ideological party, mostly pragmatic, and when it lost touch with the centre, it jettisoned its leaders, its policies, and it came back in the middle. So what Blair did was he positioned Labour. He stole the clothes from the Conservative Party, the 2 keys to power, which were to be pragmatic and to have a real hunger for office over ideological purity. He tried to achieve that riddle that all post-war prime ministers tried to achieve, which is to get economic efficiency in the country with social justice. It was a very Disraelian, Baldwin, centrist, one nation. It was one nation Labourism as opposed to one nation Toryism. And there was nowhere else for Cameron to take the Conservative Party. They differed. I often thought that Cameron was rather to the left of Tony Blair on some issues. Ideologically, they were very, very similar. And the more we come away in time from this period, the more that will become clear. Gordon Brown took the party back a little bit more to the left, not as much maybe as he would have liked. So, yeah, I think that's very, very fair. And George Osborne, supreme pragmatist, supreme operator, in many ways quicker, more, in some significant ways, brighter than Cameron. In the same kind of way, Brown was brighter in some ways than Blair, but they needed each other. Blair needed Brown. They might have been much better off without him, and Cameron needed Osborne. They might well have been much better without Osborne. And if he wasn't editor of the London Standard, then maybe I'd say even more about that. No, I would say all this. And it was, Osborne was very much the hothead, the supreme political intellect, but very rebarbative.
And what about their personalities? I mean, from a distance, Cameron and Blair seem to have a number of similarities, including upbringing, but also in their personal makeup. Is that also fair?
It's so interesting. So Tony Blair went to, both of them had Scottish roots. Tony Blair went to the Scottish Eton called Fettes in Edinburgh, and Cameron went to Eton itself. They were hugely psychologically secure people. Gordon Brown, not secure psychologically. John Major, very insecure psychologically. Theresa May, bit of both, interestingly. And they had a sense that they were loved, a sense of position, a sense of entitlement, a supreme sense of self-confidence that you need in that position where beyond the wall at the end of Downing Street, out there people are trying to mow you down in type or literally to murder you and your families. You need to have that sense of self-belief. So I think that not just ideologically, but in terms of character, both family people very devoted to their children. Blair, more obviously faith. Cameron, not so much on faith, and maybe he'll work out, maybe he will work that through more. So yeah, really good. Mm-hmm. Very, very similar. Some ways similar, in some ways similar, in other ways very different to Asquith and Lloyd George, but maybe that's too historical to look at.
Interestingly, the three Tories are cricket fanatics, and the two Labour Party Prime Ministers are not. One distinguishing
are
difference.
They really,
but,
are they really fanatics? Yeah. This is so, because everybody...
Blair, Major, May and Cameron, I think so.
Major absolutely adored cricket, grew up very much a working class boy, very much sneered at by the snobs in that party, and cricket was part of his identity at the Oval, Surrey's ground. Cameron liked cricket, not frankly so much. Sometimes politicians, as we know, top politicians need to give us this sense that they really are Man City fanatics, or they love the Wasps at rugby, or they love the Arctic Monkeys, when actually they've never quite heard who these people are. But for Major, genuine, I think it's genuine for Major, genuine. I think it's genuine for May too. Gordon Brown, of course, could have been a very successful sportsman had it not been for that eye injury. Gordon Brown's life dogged by bad luck in many ways.
I don't think you can argue that Theresa May is courting popularity by taking Jeff Boycott as her hero, despite being a Jeff Boycott fan myself.
Mind you, ABBA too. I don't quite know what that leaves us. Hey, wasn't that a clever thing to do? Mm-hmm. Wasn't that a really, really clever thing to do, and so counterintuitive. Gordon, by the way, of all the five people, by far the most interesting psychologically. All of them I think are admirable people. Blair makes me the crossest of all of them, but Gordon the most interesting psychologically, by far.
Well, I should imagine you already talked about the Blairite drift to the centre, and I should imagine that many of those who were in government with Tony Blair are not entirely happy with the direction that the Labour Party has taken in recent years. Our friend Frank Field has left, and there are also a few disgruntled pro-EU Tories kicking around as well. What do you think the chances are of a new political party starting, and what would be its chances of survival if it did?
So we are given to two-party systems. The Conservative Party which emerged in 1783, 1832. There are more historians here who will debate the precise founding of the Conservative Party, but the most successful political force in Britain. Can't see that changing. The most successive democratic political party, arguably in the history of the world. Hard to think who can challenge that. And Labour will return when Michael Foot, the far left leader, or not as far as Corbyn may be, was the party leader between 1883. We thought that would go on forever. There will be a time when Corbyn goes, when people will look back and think, what was that about? People will think the same about Trump, and the sooner the better. So I can't see the Conservatives changing from their centrist position, and I can't see Corbyn affecting a long-term structural change to Labour, because attractive though it is to many people, it does not go with the position of the electorate, which is fundamentally a centrist electorate, and which has an intolerance of people on either side. So I can't see, Philip, the space opening up. We all remember, well, we've all heard of, all remember the time that happened in 81, the birth of the Social Democrat Party, but they were by four giants, particularly Roy Jenkins, David Owen, Shirley Williams, Bill Rogers, and they were really heavyweight figures. I'd love Chuka Umunna to do it, who I taught and who I admire hugely. I'd love there to be that kind of centrist party, but I can't see it happening. But there again, 81, was that really a very wise time to start a third party at the beginning of that long spell of Thatcher dominance, with the country becoming more and more prosperous? Now, significantly because of Brexit, the country may very, very well become less and less prosperous. That opens up the possibility for a new party, the breakup of the UK, substantially on the back of Brexit. I was in Aberdeen talking last night, Ireland. The world is changing dynamically before our eyes when those wonderful benefits that the IEA and others told us will follow from Brexit do not happen, and they won't. There'll be massive disillusionment and reaction against those people who took this country into it. And if there's a no-deal Brexit, the woe will start a lot quicker than if not. So, who knows? This is such an unpredictable time, Philip, that all the logic and the history of this country of two parties predicated on our very quaint electoral first past the post system says you never get through, jinx through as a third party. That won't happen since Labour did it to the Liberals in the 1920s, but these are very strange times.
I should say that I voted Remain only just, and I do work also for the IEA, and the IEA was pretty divided on the issue and doesn't take positions, but it is fair to say that those who were in favour of Brexit in the IEA were especially noisy in that debate, and noisier certainly than I was, but I'll come back to that. Perhaps the country's waiting for Ruth and
well, I think the country certainly vote for Ruth, and Ruth Kelly in the front row here, who was a wonderful cabinet minister under Labour.
So I'm going to give you a rest for about 30 to 45 seconds now, and I just want to say a little bit about your family. Our clicker's not working. I'm hoping that Catherine will coordinate, not yet, who'll coordinate at the right points.
I'm just going to say something controversial about Gordon, because you wanted that. My experience of life is that it often takes, maybe always takes, pain to make us grow spiritually. and that pain will continue to happen until we grow inwardly and grow in compassion and wisdom and non-judgmentalism. Gordon's interesting because he had terrible pain, not just the accident when he was young and a series of reversals that made him very bitter, made him of course inflict great pain on other people, but then he lost Jennifer. Anybody who feels, I always thought, uncompassionate about Brown is listen to the day that Cameron lost his son and you hear Brown talking about it. And if only he was able somehow to transact, to grow inwardly and to get away from that narrow, suspicious, hunched shoulder judgmentalism. It's an interesting example of pain not resulting in evident growth, and I think pain will continue to damage him until he does grow.
Your family is full of remarkable stories, particularly it was a relatively small family and not that well connected in the sense that people often describe. So your grandfather's uncle was a very famous builder who was responsible for the introduction of British summertime in Britain. Your grandfather's life story was so remarkable that when it was serialised on television, one critic, thinking it was fiction, criticised it for being too far-fetched. When in fact it was factual. Your mother was an accomplished writer, your wife, and of course you. I don't know whether you realise, but you're related to the Coldplay singer Chris Martin. And your uncle, Cecil Margolis, merits a section in the Almanac of British Politics as the only Whig councillor anywhere in the country in living memory. So that's quite a lot of stories from a rather small family. And there's also your father, about whom I want to say a little bit. So Arthur Seldon was the founder, editorial director of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Here he is in 2015, the year he died. Chap on the left there is a younger version, sorry, 2005. Chap on the left there is a younger version of me. It's with his three successors. And here is a younger version of your father. And he was orphaned in the Spanish flu, along with his brothers, of course. And in adult life, he had this startling career. He took the writings of the world's greatest economists and made them accessible to a very wide audience. Nobody had ever really done that type of thing before. So Arthur is pictured here with three Nobel laureates. There's James Buchanan, Milton Friedman and Gary Becker. Here he is with a fourth, Friedrich Hayek, and he also published the work of three others. And these people were regular visitors to your house, Anthony. How did this affect your own upbringing and intellectual development?
Very interesting. So I reacted against it. I think there were a lot of conversations at home with men, and they were mostly all Austrian, and Austrian men talking about market economics. And there's only so much market economics you can fit into a day and stand. And certainly when I was at school, I became really quite radical and revolutionary and organised a demonstration and got down the alternative press to write it up. But it was against what's called the school's CCF, Combined Cadet Force, the Army. Right. But it was also against the Vietnam War. Now, interestingly, the Vietnam War did finish very soon after the revolution that we started in Tunbridge. But the CCF carried on. So, I mean, in a way, you love your dad, but it didn't totally gel with me. Even though he didn't particularly force it down, it was just everywhere. And my mother was very involved in something called the voucher experiment that was applying it, the same thinking to choice of schooling. My father, was admirable in so many ways, not the least he had this very difficult upbringing. The First World War affected so many of our lives. Probably most people in this room have been affected by the profound damage of that war did to so many people and to so many families. And losing your parents and then being adopted, not knowing till the age of 11 that he had any brothers and sisters, and his brothers and sisters, 4 of them, went off to an orphanage, and they found out that they had another brother, the youngest, and where he lived in the East End of London, and they wrote in chalk on the road outside, "Arthur is our brother." And he looked out of his window and saw this. He had a stutter all his life, probably because of that psychological insecurity and economic insecurity. I mean, it's fashionable to say that one's parents or oneself comes from great poverty, but that was a very poor Jewish background.
And you did have an ally in Chicago for your Tunbridge Wells Revolution, of course, because it was Milton Friedman who led to the abolition of conscription in and just after the Vietnam
I remember
War.
him. I mean, he would stay at home, and Hayek would stay, and Mum kind of went along with it. I never quite knew how really interested she was in market economics, and it was like a religion.
My wife's absolutely fascinated.
It was. I bet. It was like a religion in a way, but it was like a religion, I think, without the good bits, and because it kind of, religion at best makes us just, when I think it works well, makes us into much more tolerant, wider, more capacious human beings capable of experiencing things at a much deeper level, whereas to be a guru at market economics, not quite certain it does the same thing. Dad, by the way, was, there he is with the lovely guy on his right, so just here, Ralph Harris, Lord Harris of High Cross. They were really the 2 key people in it. Ralph, very keen Eurosceptic. Dad thought that, he could see the sense of Europe. He wasn't particularly Europhile, but he was certainly for remaining in, and disliked that strident. Dad disliked stridency over most political positions, and didn't like that from Ralph. That slightly took them apart. Even then, back in the 70s and 80s.
So in your family, you had a communist and Arthur, who was an arch libertarian, and Cecil Margolis, who was the only Whig councillor. But you became, if it's not a contradiction in terms, an extreme pragmatist, in a sense. You've already used that word a few times. Yeah. How did that happen? Well, from being a communist revolutionary who brought the Vietnam War to an end.
Well, thank you for saying that, Philip. Not everyone gives me that credit, but that's very nice to hear. I shall take that away. And it was a funny upbringing, and my mum, even though her father, so he was shot in the head, my grandfather, at Ypres in a place called Plug Street Wood, Plugstert, just to the south of Ypres. Couldn't work for the rest of his life, was training to be a doctor, lost all that, and he became a communist. But he still sent Mum to the private girls' school in Tunbridge Wells, and when she would leave to go home to catch the bus, he would regularly be on the railway. If anyone knows Tunbridge Wells, you know the road over the railway line. He'd be on the bridge selling copies of the Daily Worker, which was the Communist Party newspaper. So Mum would sort of cross over, and people would sort of say, who's that weird man over there? And that was her dad. So it was, I mean, I think I slightly retreated away from strong views, but always I've been much more interested in why do people take the views that they take. So I'm very much a Jungian. I always want to go down into the movements in the mind that allows people to take the positions they do take, rather than particularizing around one mental construction over another. So yeah, I mean, pragmatic, non-judgmental. I did Yeats for A-level. Anybody else do Yeats for A-level in the audience? I'm very struck by the lines, which were thinking of the Troubles in 1916 and the Troubles leading up to it. Yeats said, the best, couldn't understand it at the time, and now I can only partly understand it. He said, the best lack all conviction. Now that seems to be very odd to an 17, 18-year-old. The best lack all conviction, when we were told, it's important to be to give yourself, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And it's that passionate fervour, intensity, particularly when not grounded on compassion for other human beings or on evidence, that spells the path to the rise of populism, which is such a real threat, particularly when coupled with anti-intellectualism, such a real threat in the world today, stretching all the way from Putin via Orban, via those appalling parties in Germany and the Netherlands and France, fascist parties, to Trump in America. So I don't think this is the direction of travel of humanity if humanity is making progress.
Which I think moves us quite neatly onto education in a sense. So St Mary's and Buckingham are both very special institutions. We're both very small relative to the rest of the university sector, and have a very unique mission. Now, St Mary's has a handbook of sorts, Newman's idea of a university. Buckingham is a secular institution, but liberal in the proper intellectual sense of the word. What's your idea of a university at Buckingham?
It's a great question. I always get slightly uncomfortable, Philip, when people talk about, the university at Buckingham is small, everything about Buckingham is small. I start getting slightly paranoid that, but I'm glad that St Mary's also has a very small Vice-Chancellor too. Seriously, to be critical here, I think that Vice-Chancellors of about some 150 universities do a remarkable job, and they're overly not least about their salaries. I think they're wrong to take so much out of the system and the example that gives, but I think overall they're doing a very good job. But I have noticed that they are much keener in the description of higher education institutions. They're much keener in one of those two letters than the other. They're really like H. Now, H is really good because it gets you above other people, superior to schools, superior to many people. They're really not so keen on E, education, and very few heads of universities are educationalists and have a vision about what it means to be a rounded educational human being. And I don't think that is good enough, and I think all kinds of problems come from that. Universities, what does the word education mean? The present company accepted. I've yet to meet an education secretary who actually knows the derivation of the word education. It does mean drawing out what's inside. And because what is not drawn out will remain dormant, particularly amongst working class and less deprived people. So it's a sense of travel, it's a sense of a journey towards fullness and completion. And education is above all important for the less advantaged. The middle classes will always have much more social capital, more books, more discussion, more opportunities in their own home. But for those from genuinely disadvantaged backgrounds, it really is much harder. So in Hastings, a lady in a checkout queue at Asda was asked about what she thought. It was Margate, the new art gallery, and she said, well, it's not for people like me. And you ask, why is it not for people like me? And the answer is, it's not that her brain structure is any different, it's just she has not had the same opportunity to learn the language, look at these paintings or look at this remarkable room, to be able to understand why this is so profoundly moving and beautiful and aesthetically desirable. This wallpaper, and this is just we are in a work of art here. So as a head, I would give every child, as they go through art history, not myself, but ensure that they had art history but I'd love going along to them, lessons, so they could see the whole development of art history. Then you can develop the vocabulary to access it. It's part of what it means to be. So back to universities, it is simply not good enough to be a Vice-Chancellor and to obsess about your research and your employability and maybe now about social diversity without having a conviction, something to offer. Far too many, there are several head teachers present tonight, but I'm sorry, I'm sure you know, those that I know this doesn't count to you, but it seems that less and less heads, Philip, have any vision of what education is or anything to offer their children. You know, heads are critical in schools. Heads need to talk not just from here. You ask many heads how the school's going and they'll rip out of their head data about 5 A's to C's or Progress 8. You know, that's okay. Exam results are important, but they're not all important. For university vice-chancellors and universities, doing well in league tables is important, but it's not all important. There is something profoundly moving and important about the process of education, the responsibility on educationalists, not just to teach their subject, but to teach souls and to help people grow inwardly and in ways that cannot be measured and will never be capable of being measured is something that many vice-chancellors truthfully simply don't have, and it's a little bit disappointing.
Taking that theme on a little, you're a great champion of happiness and well-being education. As Francis mentioned in the introduction, you've done that marvellous video of the Happy song, I think in the Wellington campus.
Yeah, it was nicked. There was this guy called Pharrell Williams, a singer, who saw who saw it on YouTube and thought he'd do his own version of it.
Oh, okay. And it's been downloaded 36,000 times. I think 2,000 of those occasions were me trying to get that still.
Yeah.
But it's well worth a look. Anybody who has the time to view it. And there's been a huge increase in mental health problems, it would appear, amongst young people. And I think those who are concerned about these things don't think it's simply medicalisation of what was a pre-existing problem in society. How do you think universities and schools should respond to this crisis?
I think it gets back again to what we think education and what we think life is for. Is life purely to make us economic agents who are capable of earning high income, or is education also about helping people to prepare them for family life, for relationships where they can have giving, loving relationships that are capable of dealing with adversity that will happen and strike all relationships and ill health. Is it also about helping people to play a meaningful part in society? Is it also about helping people develop all their intelligences? Howard Gardner, let us remember, from Harvard, said, don't ask how intelligent a child is, ask rather, how is a child intelligent? And for those children who have not had their intelligences drawn out, they will remain dormant, and this contributes to mental ill health. So, it's worrying, Philip. 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 students coming up to university have or will have significant mental health problems. The average waiting time to get in to see somebody is 4 months. Suicide is increasing. A academic, Professor Searle at the University of Kentucky, tells us that a successful suicide will significantly adversely affect 135 people. And what interests me, actually rather more than Milton Friedman and Hayek or the equivalents on the left economists, I am more interested in psychology. There is a figure called Seligman. Can I just ask who is aware of Marty Seligman's work? Okay. Now, I'm just going to tell you why, because this explains, and it fits in, Philip. This is really interesting. It fits in to the thinking behind the IEA about the role of individuals and the role of the state in not infantilizing people. So Seligman, who's at the University of Pennsylvania, now in his late 70s, I've got him over in the UK on Friday fortnight, on the 19th of October. He spent 40 years of his life studying and writing about depression and mania and obsessive behavior and alcoholism and all kinds of human misery. And he wrote a very important book called Learnt Helplessness, in which he learnt that people who are sad and have other afflictions have significantly learnt how to be like that. But he then realized that we can also learn efficacy. We can learn that tomorrow does not have to be like today. I do not have to be miserable, but if you think that tomorrow is going to be like today, because today was like yesterday, then it will be. But we can learn efficacy. We can learn that we do have the power to be the authors of our own biographies, and we're not to be the victims out there. So it's a journey away from victimhood. And by the way, the NHS and many and the giving out of absurd numbers of prescription drugs merely enshrine us, entomb us in helplessness, because what good ever, other than just dealing with short-term pain, does taking pills do? It plasters over the problem. We can teach our young people the skills of managing and coping and gaining the ability to be able to cope. One could think how Gordon Brown's life might have been different. This appeals to me greatly. And so when I was at Wellington College, which is not so very far from here down the M3, I started. I mean, I'd been groping towards this always, hadn't come across Seligman's work until 10 years ago, and then started applying that work in the school and started working with others, Jeff Mulgan, who used to be head of policy in Downing Street, and Richard Layard, the economist, Lord Layard. We formed a body called Action for Happiness to promulgate the work, not totally dissimilar to the IEA with the ideas of Hayek and Friedman. And it's a very optimistic journey that we can all, teachers included, make our lives better. We can make our relationships better. We can learn how to have more tender, loving relationships with our partners. They do not have to go through a curve like that. They can go through a curve that goes up and up and up. And certainly, I was more in love with my wife at the end, even than at the beginning. And you can learn these things. I mean, in a sense, it's a shame we have to be taught, but if our schools are so rigidly teaching just cognitive skills for the passing of exams, then maybe we do have to have these things. So that is compressing a lot of information into a very quick answer. You might want to expand.
Well, that in a sense, that's anticipated and answered the other questions I was going to ask. So I think it's a good moment to open this discussion up to the floor and to ask if anybody would like to ask Anthony a question. Have we got some microphones going around? Yeah.
Where's Marty Seligman going to be on the 19th?
Oh, Marty Seligman it's a conference for non-profit conference for teachers at Friends House, the Quaker, well, formerly it's not Quaker, it's not Friends House anymore, but it's opposite Euston Station. And tickets, you can just get to it by Googling Seligman or Action for Happiness or writing to me. And there are very wonderful people also speaking there on that day about what can we practically do. The worrying truth is, the truth is that we do not know how many young people are mentally distressed. We do not know why the numbers are increasing, but they do appear to be increasing. It's not just people are reporting more incidents. There really does seem to be more stress. We can take guesses. Social media, for example, will certainly be one of the more significant factors. We don't really know, but also even more worryingly, we don't really know for certain what the best interventions are, but nevertheless there are things that we can do. One of them is how, and this goes for adults too, helping us to learn to look after our bodies better. And where the body is as healthy as we can make it, easier for some than others, it serves the mind better. So it is the case in study after study that it is as effective and in terms of the antidepressant impact running as taking antidepressant pills, but you don't get the side effects. You also gain in pride because you feel you're doing something to help your own problem. And also the importance of social behaviour. If you want to, core powerful lesson is if you want to feel good, do good to others. So this underlines philosophically why we should be spending, helping our young people volunteer. Because it's actually good for them as well as good. It's often actually better for the young person than it is for those person being helped. And conversely, if you want to feel bad, do bad to other people. So if you want to go out and mug or pass drugs around or be vicious and endlessly critical, snide about other people, that will absolutely and in a totally involuntary way make you feel bad. In the same way, when we're walking along a platform, somebody's dropped something, we go and give it to them, we cannot but help feel units of happiness at that point. It just makes us feel better. And we can transform our lives. We have the power to do it. So that's what that's about. That's when Seligman's talking, yeah.
John.
Anthony, you've been talking about a holistic education, which I think is one way you're going with this. For those of us here at St Mary's in particular, I think this has a great resonance. This place was founded by Catholic priests who were training teachers for Catholic schools. So from the beginning, in this place's DNA, is a commitment to do more than educate the mind, which is the prelude to asking, particularly for a university that is Catholic, and I would stress there that for us, our Catholicism is our point of openness to the world, not a point of closeness, the part that you think that faith can and perhaps should play in higher education, because I think higher education is, certainly in my very long experience of it now, almost entirely, almost ardently secular in its orientation, as though it is almost frightened of faith.
Well, that's a far better question from John Charmley than my answer will be, because it's a really hard question to answer. So I have a faith, and a growing faith, but I find it very hard to then be able to sell that. As a head teacher, I felt when I was at school, the Christianity of my school seemed to actually feel quite hypocritical. It didn't feel a very loving place. It felt as if it was muscular Christianity. We talk about faith being caught, not taught. I think that we are much more, I'm much more inspired by when I see goodness than when I hear people talking about goodness. And so it's difficult to I think to make opportunities available. That's very important, so that people can see and learn. To deny people opportunities to follow their faith. Interestingly, how Islamic this floor looks. Is this an original floor, by the way, of the? This won't go down well with everybody, but my own belief is that all true faiths lead in the same direction, which is about a direction of just greater and greater self-understanding and dissolution of the ego, and immersion in real knowledge and understanding and wisdom. So that's the journey upwards. But you know, John, really interesting question. What role? I think it should just be permissive. I just think there should be opportunities. It's very sad that for many students there are no religious opportunities on many campuses. There are no quiet rooms, prayer rooms, chapels, or where they are, that they are very much, you know, down untrodden corridors. But also, I think there's a kind of what I feel is a fascism from the Richard Dawkins, A.C. Grayling, just because they haven't found any spiritual truth in their own lives. They try then to use their authority of their disciplines and their eminence in their own fields to dismiss the attempts by anybody else to find truth in their own lives. They will never find truth as long as they think that their thinking part of their brain is all that there is, because faith, truth transcends that. We are much more than just our brains. And for those who want to make that journey, a journey into stillness, I'd love to take Richard Dawkins to a monastery and just... I've got close to taking a genuinely wonderful man who is Martin, well, I think I have, Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal, wonderful Lord Rees, who's very open to this kind of thinking, and just say it's not about thinking, it's about letting go of thinking, it's about being, it's not about having and holding, but you can only experience it. It isn't, you're never going to argue anybody into that position. It's an intimation of depth, and it's very hard therefore to have it in a role. But I do think there's a massive role for atheism in universities, but there also could be more respect for those who do not want to have that route.
Thank you, Anthony. It's been fascinating to listen to you, and I'm delighted that you've been able to come to St Mary's